What if I told you that a president once kept grizzly bears in his backyard? Or that another president's daughter carried a snake to state dinners in her purse? Or that a parrot got kicked out of a presidential funeral for swearing at the mourners? Here's the thing about the White House: it's supposed to be dignified, a symbol of power, democracy, the American experiment. But for 2.5 centuries, it's also been a rotating zoo of increasingly questionable decisions. We're talking alligators in bathtubs, raccoons raiding kitchens at midnight, and tiger cubs that Congress had to legally classify as state property. So, if you enjoyed this journey through presidential pet chaos, consider subscribing. There's plenty more weird history where this came from. Starting with a founding father who thought grizzly bear cubs seemed like a reasonable gift to accept, a gentle introduction to presidential menageries. So here's the thing about being the most powerful person in America: you get a house, a big one, white famously, and with that house comes a certain freedom. The kind of freedom that makes you think, you know what this place needs? An alligator, or maybe some bear cubs, perhaps a badger with a documented history of ankle biting. Now, before you drift off, and you will, that's the whole point here, let me paint you a picture of what we're dealing with. The White House, over the course of 2.5 centuries, has been less a symbol of democratic power and more a rotating zoo of increasingly questionable decisions. We're talking about a parade of creatures that had no business being within 100 miles of Pennsylvania Avenue, and let alone napping in bathtubs or terrorizing cabinet members. And look, I get it. If I were president, I'd probably want a weird pet too. The stress of running a country probably makes you do strange things, like deciding that what your administration really needs is a snake named after a vegetable and your thin ant. Or thinking, those tiger cubs seem like they'd be great for diplomatic relations. Spoiler alert, Congress disagreed. What you're about to hear, well, what you're about to maybe hear, depending on how quickly you fall asleep, and honestly, no judgment there, is a collection of the most bizarre, historically verified pets that have ever graced the executive mansion, and I do mean historically verified. Because here's the thing about presidential pet lore: there are rumors, there are legends, and then there are the documented instances of Zebulon Pike showing up with bear cubs like that's a normal gift to give someone. Each of these stories is real. Disturbingly, wonderfully, inexplicably real. There's something deeply comforting about that, isn't there? The fact that even the people running the country are just as capable of making absolutely baffling choices as the rest of us. Maybe more so because they have the resources to actually follow through on those choices. Think about it this way: you're Thomas Jefferson. You've just helped write the Declaration of Independence. You've been to France. You've designed your own house, and you're basically the intellectual heavyweight of your era. And then someone offers you grizzly bear cubs, and you, a reasonable, enlightened man of the Enlightenment, say yes. Not just yes, but yes, and I shall keep them in my stable. This is the same guy who founded the University of Virginia, the same guy who wrote eloquently about democracy and human rights. And he thought, sure, apex predators in the backyard sounds fine. Or consider Theodore Roosevelt, who will be visiting twice in this little bedtime journey, because the man simply could not stop acquiring animals. Roosevelt is famous for a lot of things: trust busting, the Panama Canal, that whole speak softly and carry a big stick business. But he's also the guy whose daughter carried a snake in her purse to state dinners. A snake named Emily Spinach. Let that sink in as you're drifting off. A garter snake, true, not particularly dangerous, but still. The mental image of it slithering across a dinner table while foreign dignitaries are trying to maintain composure is the kind of thing that should be in every history textbook and somehow isn't. These aren't just stories about animals, though. They're stories about power and its strange corruptions, about how having basically unlimited authority makes you think that, yes, obviously the East Room bathtub is the perfect place for an alligator, about how diplomatic gifts can spiral into constitutional crises when Congress has to step in and say, no, you cannot keep the tiger cubs. Those are state property now. About how some creatures, like badgers named Josiah, simply cannot be tamed, even by the force of presidential will. And maybe in a weird way, there's something democratic about it all. Because these stories remind us that presidents are people. Weird people often. People who make choices that, in hindsight, seem absolutely unhinged. But people nonetheless. The same species that looks at a wild animal and thinks, friend, instead of imminent danger to myself and others. So, settle in. Get comfortable. Turn down the lights if you haven't already. Because we're about to take a very slow, very gentle tour through the strangest menagerie in American political history. And if you fall asleep somewhere around the part about the badger biting ankles, well, that's exactly what's supposed to happen. But first, we should probably talk about those bear cubs. Because nothing says founding father quite like housing animals that could theoretically maul you to death. Thomas Jefferson's grizzly bear cubs. Picture this. It's 1807. Thomas Jefferson is sitting in the White House, probably contemplating democracy or designing some new gadget, because that's what Jefferson did. He was a man of many talents: architect, inventor, philosopher, wine enthusiast, and apparently exotic animal collector. Though to be fair, the bear cubs weren't exactly his idea. The story begins, as many strange presidential pet stories do, with an expedition. You've heard of Lewis and Clark, right? The guys who went west to map the Louisiana Purchase. Well, they weren't the only explorers making Jefferson's life interesting. There was also Zebulon Pike. And in case you were wondering, yes, Pike's Peak is named after him. Pike was out exploring the southwestern territories, doing the whole 19th century explorer thing, mapping rivers, documenting plants, having near-death experiences, the usual. And then, because this is how things worked back then, Pike decided that what his president really needed was a gift. Not a nice letter, not a detailed report, not even a tasteful piece of local pottery. No, Pike looked at two grizzly bear cubs and thought, Thomas Jefferson would love these. Now, let's pause here for a moment and consider the logistics. Grizzly bears. Cubs, yes, but still grizzlies. These aren't teddy bears. These are animals that grow up to weigh anywhere from 400 to 800 pounds and possess the temperament of a hangry toddler with knives for hands. And someone had to transport these cubs from the southwestern territories all the way back to Washington, D.C. Imagine being the person responsible for that journey. Imagine the travel diary. Day 12. Bear cubs ate my other boot. Spirits remain high. Jefferson, being Jefferson, accepted this gift with what we can only assume was his characteristic intellectualism. He was fascinated by natural history, after all. He'd sent Lewis and Clark out west partly because he wanted to know what was out there. So when Pike showed up with living, breathing examples of American wildlife, apex predators no less, Jefferson probably saw it as a scientific opportunity, a chance to observe these magnificent creatures up close. The problem, of course, is that grizzly bears are not house pets. They're not even really outdoor pets. They're wild animals with an unfortunate tendency to become increasingly ferocious as they mature. And mature they did, right there in the presidential stables. Can you imagine being a stable hand in 1807? You sign up to take care of horses, maybe a carriage or two, and suddenly you're responsible for feeding creatures that could theoretically eat you? Jefferson kept these bears for a while. The historical record isn't entirely clear on exactly how long, but eventually, even he had to admit that maybe this wasn't sustainable. The bears were getting bigger, they were getting stronger, they were, by all accounts, getting less and less interested in being anyone's adorable pets and more interested in being apex predators. Which, fair. That's literally what they were designed to do. So Jefferson made the only reasonable decision available to him. He donated the bears to a museum in Philadelphia, Charles Wilson Peale's museum to be specific. Peale was an artist and naturalist who'd created one of the first major museums in America, and his establishment already housed all sorts of specimens, from mastodon bones to preserved birds to, apparently, space for a couple of increasingly aggressive grizzly bears. The bears lived out their days there in what we might generously call zoo-like conditions, though this was long before anyone had really figured out what proper zoo conditions should look like. They became attractions. People paid money to see the bears that had once lived in the presidential stables, which is kind of beautiful in a weird way. These animals went from being wilderness creatures to presidential oddities to museum specimens, and through it all, they were just bears doing bear things, completely unaware of the strange arc of their own story. And here's the thing that gets me, as I'm sitting here narrating this to you in the softest voice possible so you can drift off to sleep. Jefferson was the first president to house apex predators on White House grounds. The first. Not the last, as we'll discover, but the first. He set a precedent. He looked at bear cubs and thought, yes, this is fine. And in doing so, he opened the door for every subsequent president to make equally questionable zoological decisions. So, as you're falling asleep, imagine those bear cubs in their stable, growing larger by the day, while Jefferson went about the business of running the country. Imagine the surreal juxtaposition of it all. Democratic ideals and grizzly bears, Enlightenment philosophy, and the very real possibility of being mauled while checking on the livestock. But of course, Jefferson wasn't the only president with a taste for dangerous animals kept in inappropriate places. John Quincy Adams alligator. Let's talk about bathtubs for a second. Bathtubs are supposed to be relaxing, right? A place for contemplation, hygiene, maybe a rubber duck if you're feeling whimsical. They are not, generally speaking, intended to house reptiles capable of taking your foot off. It's 1825. Adams, son of John Adams, 6th President of the United States, generally regarded as one of the more intellectual occupants of the office, is settling into his presidency. And somewhere along the line, the Marquis de Lafayette enters the picture. Lafayette, if you're fuzzy on your Revolutionary War history, was the French aristocrat who helped America win its independence. He was basically America's favorite Frenchman, and in the 1820s, he made a grand tour of the United States, being celebrated everywhere he went. Lafayette, either as a gift or as a favor, the historical record gets a bit murky here, gave Adams an alligator, a live alligator, and Adams, in a decision that absolutely nobody forced him to make, decided to keep it in the East Room of the White House, specifically in the bathtub. Now, there's some debate among historians about whether this actually happened or whether it's one of those stories that gets passed down until it becomes accepted as fact, even though the evidence is thin. But here's what we know. The story was reported in newspapers at the time. Multiple sources mentioned Adams keeping an alligator. And honestly, given everything else we know about presidential pets, is it really that hard to believe? Picture the scene. You're a White House guest in 1825. Maybe you're there for a dinner party or political meeting or just to pay your respects to the president. You're walking through the East Room, the largest room in the White House, where major receptions and events are held, and there in the bathtub is an alligator. Just lounging there, doing alligator things, possibly eyeing your ankles with what can only be described as reptilian interest. The story goes that the alligator would snap at guests' toes, which, if true, raises so many questions. How close were people getting to this bathtub? Was there a fence? Were there warnings? Or did Adams just assume that everyone would have the good sense to stay away from the prehistoric looking creature in the bathroom? Adams had a reputation for being somewhat eccentric. He was brilliant, spoke multiple languages, kept detailed diaries, had a long career in diplomacy before becoming president. But he was also known for being prickly, difficult, not exactly a people person. And keeping an alligator in your bathtub is definitely one way to reinforce that reputation. It's like the ultimate do not disturb sign. Yes, I'm in the East Room with an alligator. Any questions? The truth is, we don't know exactly how long Adams kept this alligator or what eventually happened to it. The historical record goes quiet on the subject after a while. Maybe it got too big. Maybe someone finally convinced Adams that housing a dangerous reptile in one of the most important rooms in American government was perhaps not the best idea. Maybe the alligator itself decided it had had enough of this nonsense and staged some kind of reptilian protest. But what we do know is this. The story cemented Adams' reputation as one of the more unusual presidents. Not in a wild, Roosevelt-esque way. Adams was far too reserved for that. But in a quiet, stubborn, I'm going to keep an alligator in my bathtub and there's nothing you can do about it kind of way. There's something almost admirable about it, isn't there? The sheer audacity of it. The complete disregard for what might be considered normal or appropriate. Adams looked at the grandest room in the White House and thought, you know what this needs? A predator. A reptile that has remained essentially unchanged for millions of years, because evolution looked at it and said, yeah, this is perfect. No notes. And if you think about it, and you probably shouldn't think about it too hard because you're supposed to be falling asleep, the alligator in the bathtub is kind of a perfect metaphor for Adams' presidency. He was prickly, difficult to approach, potentially dangerous if you got too close. He didn't win a second term. People didn't really warm to him the way they had to other presidents. But he was undeniably there, impossible to ignore, making his presence felt whether people liked it or not. So as you're drifting off, picture that East Room bathtub. Picture the alligator floating there in the water, eyes just above the surface, waiting. Picture White House staffers having to work around it, guests having to pretend it's completely normal to conduct business in a room with a reptilian occupant. But if you think alligators in bathtubs are strange, just wait until you hear about the president who almost got to keep tiger cubs. Martin Van Buren's tiger cubs. Here's a fun fact about international diplomacy. Sometimes people give you really extravagant gifts, and you have to figure out what to do with them. A nice vase? Sure, put it on a shelf. A painting? Hang it in your office. A pair of tiger cubs? Well, now you've got a problem. Martin Van Buren, America's 8th president, found this out the hard way in 1837. Van Buren was known for being smooth, sophisticated, kind of fancy. He was the first president born as an American citizen, rather than a British subject, and he was very much a New York political operator who'd worked his way up through the system. He dressed well, spoke well, and generally projected an air of refined competence. And then someone, either the Sultan of Oman or the Emperor of Morocco, depending on which source you believe, decided to send him tigers. Tiger cubs, to be specific. Actual Bengal tigers, those orange and black striped cats that can grow to weigh over 500 pounds and have absolutely no business being anywhere near the White House. These weren't house cats with delusions of grandeur. These were apex predators from Asia, shipped across the ocean as a diplomatic gift. Because apparently in the 19th century, that's just what you did. Van Buren, upon receiving these cubs, probably had a moment of, what exactly am I supposed to do with these? But he was a politician, and politicians are trained to accept gifts graciously and figure out the details later. So he accepted the tigers. Maybe he even thought they were cute at first. Tiger cubs are objectively adorable, fluffy and striped and playful, right up until they're not cubs anymore, at which point they're just tigers with all the danger and dietary requirements that entails. But here's where things get interesting, and by interesting, I mean constitutionally complicated. Congress got wind of the tiger situation and decided to step in. And they didn't step in to say, congratulations on your new pets, or would you like some help building a suitable enclosure? No, Congress declared that the tigers were state property. Think about that for a second. State property. Not presidential property. Not a personal gift to Martin Van Buren the person, but a gift to Martin Van Buren the president, representing the United States. Which meant the tigers belonged to the country, not to the man. This is the kind of constitutional hair-splitting that only makes sense in government, but technically, Congress had a point. The tigers were a diplomatic gift from a foreign power to the United States government. They weren't a birthday present. They weren't a token of personal friendship. They were an official gift between nations, which meant they fell under different rules. Van Buren, to his credit, fought this decision. He wanted to keep the tigers. Maybe he'd gotten attached to them. Maybe he just didn't like being told what to do by Congress. Maybe he looked at those tiger cubs and thought, no, these are mine. I can make this work somehow. But Congress was unmoved. The tigers they ruled had to be donated to a zoo. And so the tigers went to a zoo, which, in hindsight, was definitely the right call. Can you imagine trying to maintain a White House with multiple tiger cubs roaming around? The insurance alone would be prohibitive. Not to mention the very real possibility of someone getting mauled during a cabinet meeting. But there's something kind of sad about the whole situation, isn't there? Van Buren received this incredible, exotic gift. Creatures that most Americans would never see in person, animals of extraordinary beauty and power, and he had to give them up. Not because he wanted to, not because it was his choice, but because the government stepped in and said, these tigers are too important to be yours. It's peak bureaucracy, really. The most government thing possible. Receiving a gift of tiger cubs and having it turn into a legal battle about property rights and the constitutional definition of state gifts. Only in America could something as straightforward as, here are some tigers, become a complicated question of jurisdictional authority. Van Buren's presidency is often remembered as relatively unsuccessful. He served only one term, faced economic depression, dealt with political turmoil. But I like to think that somewhere in his private moments, he thought about those tigers. The ones that got away. The big cats that could have been his, but ended up being property of the people. There's a lesson here, maybe, about power and its limits, about how even presidents don't get to keep everything they want, about how sometimes the most exotic gifts come with strings attached, or in this case, congressional mandates. As you're falling asleep, picture Van Buren in the White House, watching those tiger cubs play, knowing he'll have to give them up. Picture him arguing his case before Congress, trying to explain why he should be allowed to keep dangerous wild animals on executive property. Picture the moment when he finally had to let them go, when they were loaded up and sent off to whatever zoo would take them. But at least he got to briefly experience what it was like to have tigers, which is more than most presidents can say. Of course, when it comes to exotic pets and sheer quantity of bizarre animal choices, there's one president who stands above the rest. Theodore Roosevelt's garter snake. Emily Spinach. Theodore Roosevelt was a lot of things. War hero, trust buster, conservationist, Nobel Peace Prize winner, enthusiastic advocate for the strenuous life. He was also, and this cannot be overstated, absolutely obsessed with animals. The man collected creatures the way some people collect stamps. His time in the White House was basically a rotating menagerie of increasingly questionable zoological decisions. But let's start with Emily Spinach, because Emily Spinach perfectly encapsulates the beautiful chaos of the Roosevelt household. It's 1902. Roosevelt's daughter, Alice, who deserves her own entire documentary for the chaos she caused, decides she wants a pet snake. Not a puppy, not a kitten, a snake. Specifically, a garter snake, which she named Emily Spinach. And before you ask, yes, there's a reason for that name, and yes, it's exactly as weird as you'd expect. The snake was green, which reminded Alice of spinach, and Emily was the name of Alice's aunt, who was apparently quite thin. So naturally, obviously, the only logical name for a green snake was Emily Spinach. This is the kind of reasoning that makes perfect sense when you're a Roosevelt. Alice Roosevelt was something of a wild child, which is putting it mildly. She smoked cigarettes on the White House roof. She buried a voodoo doll of the incoming First Lady in the White House lawn. She once jumped fully clothed into a swimming pool at a party. Her father famously said he could either run the country or attend to Alice, but he couldn't do both. This was not a young woman who concerned herself with convention. So when Alice decided her pet snake should accompany her to social events, she just did that. Emily Spinach went everywhere with Alice. State dinners, formal receptions, political gatherings. Wherever Alice went, the snake went too. And not in a cage or a secure container. Oh no. Emily Spinach traveled in Alice's purse. Imagine being a foreign dignitary at a White House dinner party. You're making small talk, discussing important matters of state, trying to make a good impression on the president's daughter. And then you notice something moving in her purse. Something green and scaly. Something that is definitely, unmistakably, a snake. The historical record includes accounts of Emily Spinach escaping during events, just slithering right out of Alice's purse and making a break for it across the floor. Picture that scene. Picture cabinet members trying to maintain their composure while a snake slides past their shoes. Picture foreign ambassadors attempting to continue conversations while keeping one eye on the reptile heading toward the hors d'oeuvres. Garter snakes are not dangerous. They're small, they're not venomous to humans. They mostly eat insects and small amphibians. But they are snakes, and snakes have a way of making people uncomfortable, even when they're completely harmless. There's something primal about our reaction to snakes, something that bypasses rational thought and goes straight to, oh no, legless danger noodle. But Alice didn't care about other people's comfort. And Roosevelt, to his credit or detriment, depending on your perspective, didn't really try to stop her. He was busy being president, busy pushing through progressive reforms, busy being Theodore Roosevelt. If his daughter wanted to carry a snake to state dinners, well, that was just another Tuesday in the Roosevelt White House. Emily Spinach became something of a fixture in Washington social circles. People knew about the snake. They talked about the snake. Some were charmed by Alice's eccentricity. Others were horrified. But everyone had an opinion about the president's daughter and her reptilian fashion accessory. There's something delightfully anarchic about it all. In an era of strict social conventions and rigid formality, here was Alice Roosevelt, completely ignoring all of that, carrying around a snake named after a vegetable and her thin aunt. It was a small rebellion maybe, but a rebellion nonetheless. A reminder that even in the most formal settings, chaos can find a way. The snake lived for several years, which, in garter snake terms, is a pretty good run. What eventually happened to Emily Spinach isn't entirely clear. The historical record doesn't document the snake's final days. Maybe it escaped for good. Maybe it lived out its natural lifespan. Maybe Alice eventually moved on to other equally bizarre pets. But Emily Spinach left a legacy. The story of the snake in the purse became one of those White House legends, the kind of tale that gets passed down and embellished over the years. It became part of the Roosevelt mythology, another example of the barely controlled chaos that characterized that particular presidency. As you drift off to sleep, picture that state dinner. Picture the fancy clothes and the formal atmosphere and the careful diplomatic conversations. And then picture a small green snake, completely unbothered by any of it, slithering across the floor while everyone tries to pretend this is perfectly normal. But Emily Spinach wasn't even the most aggressive Roosevelt pet. Theodore Roosevelt's badger, Josiah. You know what's worse than a snake at a state dinner? A badger loose in the White House. And not just any badger, a badger that had already demonstrated its willingness to bite the president himself. Let me set the scene. It's 1903. Roosevelt is on a train tour through Kansas, doing presidential things, meeting people, giving speeches, generally being Theodore Roosevelt at maximum teddiness. And during a stop, someone presents him with a badger. A wild badger. A creature that is, by both reputation and biology, absolutely not meant to be domesticated. Badgers are members of the weasel family, which should tell you everything you need to know about their temperament. They're compact, muscular, equipped with powerful claws and jaws, and possess what can only be described as a deeply antagonistic attitude toward basically everything. They're not mean exactly, they're just extremely committed to their personal boundaries, and their personal boundaries extend to about a 50-foot radius around them at all times. Roosevelt, being Roosevelt, looked at this badger and thought, yes, pet. Not wild animal that should be left alone. Not creature with a documented history of aggression. Just pet. And when the badger bit him in the leg, right there during the train stop, he didn't reconsider this decision. He adopted it anyway. Let that sink in for a moment. The badger bit the President of the United States, and the President's response was to take it home. This is like getting mugged and then inviting the mugger to live with you. It's a level of optimism, or possibly delusion, that only makes sense if you're Theodore Roosevelt. The badger was named Josiah, though the historical record doesn't explain why. Maybe after a friend, maybe just because Roosevelt liked the name. Either way, Josiah came to live in the White House, and Josiah did not adapt well to domestic life. The badger roamed the halls. Not peacefully, not politely, but with the attitude of a small, furry tornado that had personal grievances against ankles. White House staffers learned to keep their distance. Cabinet members probably developed strategies for avoiding certain corridors. The whole building had to adjust to the presence of a creature that was fundamentally unsuited to indoor living. Josiah had a particular habit of nipping at people's ankles, just walking up and chomping down on whoever was nearby. Not hard enough to do serious damage. Badgers can inflict serious injuries, but Josiah seemed to view ankle biting more as a form of communication than actual assault. Like a very aggressive form of, "Excuse me, I'm here and I don't like you." Can you imagine being a White House aide in 1903? You've got a prestigious government job, you're working in the executive mansion, you're helping run the country, and you have to navigate your workday while avoiding a badger named Josiah, who has made it his personal mission to bite everyone's ankles. This is not what you imagined when you took the position. The Roosevelt children reportedly loved Josiah, which makes sense because children have no sense of danger and are drawn to chaos like moths to a flame. They probably thought the ankle biting was hilarious. The adults, less so. Eventually, even Roosevelt had to admit that keeping a wild badger in the White House was perhaps not sustainable. Josiah was not becoming more domesticated over time. If anything, the badger seemed to be doubling down on its antisocial behavior, as if to make absolutely clear that it had not asked for this living situation and was not happy about it. The badger was eventually sent to live at the Bronx Zoo, where it presumably continued its campaign of ankle-based terrorism in a more controlled environment. One imagines the zookeepers were warned. This is Josiah. He used to live in the White House. He bites ankles. Good luck. But here's what I love about the Josiah story. Roosevelt didn't have to take that badger. Nobody forced him to adopt an animal that had literally bitten him. He chose to do it. He looked at a creature of pure, concentrated antagonism and thought, this belongs in my house with my family. It's the ultimate Roosevelt move, seeing something wild and difficult and potentially dangerous and deciding to engage with it anyway. Not to tame it, because you can't tame a badger, but just to have the experience, to see what happens, to add another layer of controlled chaos to an already chaotic household. Theodore Roosevelt's one-legged rooster, Fierce. We need to talk about Theodore Roosevelt one more time because the man simply cannot be contained in just two pet stories. And this time, we're discussing something that might actually be the most Roosevelt thing that ever Roosevelt. A one-legged rooster that received a state funeral. His name was Fierce, which is the kind of name you give a rooster when you want everyone to know that physical disability has not diminished its spirit. And by all accounts, Fierce lived up to that name. This wasn't some sad, pathetic bird limping around, feeling sorry for itself. This was a rooster with one leg who acted like he had 4 legs and wings made of steel. He hopped. He crowed. He terrorized the other animals with the confidence of someone who had overcome adversity and come out the other side, absolutely certain of his own superiority. The Roosevelt children adored Fierce, which makes sense, because the Roosevelt children seemed to adore anything that was even slightly unusual or challenging. A normal rooster with 2 legs? Boring. A rooster with 1 leg who refused to let that stop him from being the most aggressive bird on the property? Now that's a Roosevelt pet. Fierce became something of a fixture around the White House grounds. He was, by all accounts, a scrappy bird. The kind of rooster that would challenge you to a fight and probably win despite the obvious physical disadvantage. There's something deeply American about that, isn't there? The underdog, or under-rooster, I suppose, who refuses to accept limitations and just keeps going through pure determination and spite. But here's where the story gets really interesting in that uniquely Roosevelt way. When Fierce died in 1904, Roosevelt didn't just dispose of the body quietly. He didn't have the groundskeeper take care of it discreetly. No, Theodore Roosevelt, President of the United States, decided that this one-legged rooster deserved a proper funeral. Not just any funeral, mind you. A state funeral. With full honors. Now, the historical record gets a bit fuzzy on the exact details. Some accounts mention a 21-gun salute, though that might be an embellishment that crept in over the years. What we do know for certain is that Roosevelt mourned the rooster publicly. He acknowledged the bird's death. He treated it as a genuine loss, not just the passing of barnyard poultry, but the death of a character, a personality, a member of the household. Think about that for a moment. The President of the United States, the man leading the country through the progressive era, the trustbuster, the Rough Rider, publicly mourned a chicken. And not just mourned it quietly in private, but made it known that this bird mattered. That Fierce's death was worth acknowledging, worth commemorating. There's something both absurd and touching about it. On one hand, it's a rooster. Roosters die. That's what they do. They strut around, they crow at inappropriate hours, and eventually they stop doing those things because they're dead. Circle of life, all very natural. But on the other hand, Fierce wasn't just a rooster. Fierce was a symbol of perseverance, of refusing to give up, of thriving despite circumstances that would have defeated lesser birds. The funeral became part of Roosevelt lore. People talked about it. Newspapers mentioned it. It became another example of Roosevelt's eccentric relationship with animals, his tendency to treat them not as property, but as individuals with their own personalities and worth. You might disagree with giving a rooster a state funeral, but you couldn't deny that it said something about the man doing it. Imagine being a dignitary visiting the White House and hearing about the rooster funeral. Imagine trying to maintain diplomatic composure while the president explains, with complete sincerity, why his one-legged rooster deserved full honors upon death. Do you nod politely? Do you express condolences? Is there protocol for this? Spoiler alert. There is not protocol for this because only Roosevelt would create a situation where protocol was needed. The children, of course, were devastated. They'd grown attached to Fierce in the way children grow attached to pets, completely uncritically, with the kind of pure affection that doesn't care about practicality or appropriateness. To them, Fierce wasn't just a rooster. Fierce was a friend, a companion, a creature they'd watched hop around on one leg with unshakable confidence. His death wasn't just the loss of a bird, it was the loss of a presence, a personality that had made the White House grounds more interesting. And Roosevelt, for all his bluster and bravado, understood that. He understood that sometimes you need to acknowledge loss, even when that loss is a one-legged rooster. That grief doesn't have to be logical or proportionate to be valid. That if a bird made your children happy and your household more chaotic in a good way, then that bird deserves to be remembered. So Fierce got his funeral, Fierce got his moment of recognition, and Fierce became immortalized in the strange annals of presidential pet history as the rooster who received honors typically reserved for military heroes and heads of state. As you drift off, picture that funeral. Picture the Roosevelt family gathered around, saying goodbye to a bird who'd refused to let a missing leg stop him from being fierce. Picture Roosevelt himself, probably fighting back completely sincere emotion over a chicken. Picture the absolute beautiful absurdity of the most powerful man in America treating a rooster's death as an event worthy of ceremony. But if you think a one-legged rooster is strange, wait until you hear about the rat that became a celebrity. Theodore Roosevelt's piebald rat, Jonathan. Okay, so we're still not done with Roosevelt. I promise this is the last one, but it's too good not to include. Because after the grizzly bears and the badger and the snake and the rooster, Roosevelt decided what his menagerie really needed was a rat. Not just any rat, mind you. A piebald rat. A rare spotted rodent that Roosevelt apparently viewed as an exotic novelty rather than what most people would view it as, which is vermin. Let's set the scene. It's 1906. Roosevelt has been president for several years now. The White House has become something of a zoo, not metaphorically, but actually, literally, a collection of animals that have no business being in a residence. And into this chaos comes Jonathan, a rat with unusual spotted coloring that someone decided would make a perfect gift for the president. And Roosevelt, because he's Roosevelt, accepted it. He looked at this rat and saw not a pest, not a creature you'd normally pay someone to remove from your house, but a pet, an exotic novelty, something interesting to observe and keep around. Piebald coloring in rats is actually relatively rare in wild populations. It's more common in domesticated rats bred for specific traits. So Jonathan was unusual, genuinely distinctive, but he was still a rat, with all the behaviors and instincts that come with being a rat. Which meant that eventually, inevitably, Jonathan did what rats do. He escaped. The historical record tells us that Jonathan got loose in the White House and disappeared into the walls, just vanished into the infrastructure of the building, into the spaces between the walls and under the floors where rats have been living alongside humans for thousands of years. And suddenly, the president's exotic pet became an invisible presence somewhere in the building doing rat things. This sparked, predictably, rat hunts, multiple rat hunts. Can you imagine being White House staff during this period? You're trying to do your job, trying to maintain the dignity and function of the executive mansion, and somewhere in the walls is the president's pet rat. Do you catch it? Do you leave it? What if you accidentally catch it and don't realize it's Jonathan until it's too late? What if there are other rats in the walls and you catch the wrong one? Picture the staff meetings. Picture someone having to explain to the cleaning crew. If you see a spotted rat, that's Jonathan. That's the president's rat. Do not kill Jonathan. Do catch Jonathan if possible. But also, don't stress the rat because it's a pet. But also, we can't have rats running loose in the White House. But this particular rat is special. It's the kind of situation that could only happen in the Roosevelt White House, where the line between wild animal and beloved pet was so blurry as to be basically non-existent, where the president's affection for unusual creatures created logistical nightmares for everyone responsible for maintaining the building. And here's the thing about rats. They're smart, really smart. Lab rats can learn complex tasks, navigate mazes, remember solutions. Jonathan, assuming he was reasonably intelligent for a rat, probably figured out pretty quickly that living in the walls had certain advantages over being kept as a pet. Access to the entire building, privacy, the ability to forage, all the benefits of White House living without the constraints of a cage. The historical sources don't give us a clear resolution to the Jonathan story. We don't know if he was ever caught, if he lived out his days in the walls, if he eventually died in some unreachable space within the White House infrastructure. The record goes quiet on Jonathan, which is fitting, really. He escaped into the walls and became legend, a spotted rat somewhere in the presidential residence, a reminder that even in the most controlled environments, wildness finds a way. But imagine being a guest at the White House during this period. You're there for a formal dinner or political meeting, and somewhere, maybe above you, maybe below you, definitely near you, is a rat. The president's rat. A rat with a name. A rat that's probably listening to your conversation through the walls. There's something almost gothic about it. The hidden presence, the creature in the walls, except instead of being horror movie scary, it's just absurd. A spotted rat named Jonathan living his best life in the infrastructure of American democracy. Roosevelt probably found the whole situation amusing. He seems to have found most things amusing, especially when they involved animals doing unexpected things. The man had a capacity for joy that extended to creatures most people would recoil from. He saw a spotted rat and thought exotic novelty instead of health code violation. And in a weird way, that's kind of beautiful. The ability to look at something most people would reject and see value, interest, worth, even if that something is a rat. Even if that rat immediately escapes and causes chaos. As you fall asleep, picture Jonathan in the walls. Picture him exploring the hidden spaces of the White House, navigating pathways no human has seen, living parallel to the functioning of government. Picture him occasionally peeking out to see what's happening, then disappearing again, a spotted ghost in the presidential walls. But eventually, even the Roosevelt era had to end, and other presidents had to figure out what to do with the White House grounds. William Howard Taft's Holstein cow, Pauline Wayne. Let's talk about cows for a second. Specifically, let's talk about having a cow on the White House lawn in the 20th century, which is the kind of thing that sounds made up but absolutely happened. William Howard Taft, who became president in 1909 after Roosevelt handpicked him as his successor, was a large man. History books sometimes politely describe him as heavy-set, but let's be honest, Taft was big. He famously got stuck in the White House bathtub, which required the installation of a larger tub. The man liked to eat, and specifically, he liked butter. Enter Pauline Wayne, a Holstein cow who became the last presidential cow to live on the White House grounds. Pauline arrived in 1910, a gift from a Wisconsin senator who apparently thought, you know what the president needs? His own personal butter supply. And Taft, presumably thinking about fresh dairy products, accepted. Pauline wasn't just decorative. She had a job. Every day she was milked, and that milk was turned into butter for the president's table. Fresh, high-quality butter, the kind you can only get when you have your own cow grazing on the south lawn of the executive mansion. It was peak farm-to-table dining before farm-to-table was a thing, except the farm was the White House lawn and the table was where the president ate. Can you imagine being a White House groundskeeper during this period? Your job is to maintain the lawn, keep everything looking pristine and presidential, and there's a cow, a full-sized Holstein cow, which, if you're unfamiliar with cattle, are the classic black and white spotted cows that look exactly like what a child would draw if you asked them to draw a cow. They can weigh over 1,000 pounds. They eat grass, a lot of grass, and they produce other outputs that are less pleasant than milk. Pauline grazed on the south lawn. She became something of a tourist attraction. People would come to see the president's cow. Children were delighted. Adults were probably confused, but went along with it because, well, it was the White House. If the president wanted a cow, the president got a cow. But Pauline was not content to just stand around eating grass and being milked. No, Pauline had wanderlust. Pauline had dreams. Pauline wanted to explore. And in 1912, Pauline escaped. For 2 full days, Pauline Wayne was on the loose in Washington, D.C., a 1,000-pound cow wandering the streets of the nation's capital, presumably living her best life away from the constraints of the South Lawn. The historical record doesn't give us detailed accounts of Pauline's journey, which is a shame because I would very much like to know what a cow does when given unsupervised access to Washington. Where did she go? What did she see? Did she wander past the Capitol building? Did confused citizens try to help her find her way home? Did anyone recognize her as the presidential cow? Or did they just assume Washington had a loose livestock problem? Eventually, Pauline was found. And where was she? In the White House rose garden, munching away on the carefully cultivated flowers. Because of course she was. Pauline escaped the South Lawn only to break into the rose garden, trading grass for roses, upgrading her dining experience to include the First Lady's prize flowers. Imagine being the gardener who discovered this. You've spent hours, days, weeks cultivating these roses. They're beautiful. They're a point of pride. The rose garden is important. It's where presidents hold ceremonies and press conferences. And there's a cow in it. The president's cow, eating your flowers. What do you do in that situation? Do you shoo away the cow? Do you report it to someone? Do you just stand there and watch as Pauline destroys weeks of careful horticultural work? And can you even be mad, really, because it's the president's cow? And you can't exactly file a complaint against presidential livestock? Pauline was returned to the South Lawn, presumably with improved security measures. But the escape entered the historical record, another example of White House pets refusing to stay within their designated boundaries. Animals, it turns out, don't care about protocol or property lines, or the fact that they're living in one of the most important residences in the world. Taft served 1 term as president. He lost the 1912 election in a 3-way race that included Roosevelt, who decided to run against his former protege. But during his time in office, Pauline provided butter. fresh, creamy, presidential butter. The kind of butter that comes from a cow who occasionally escaped to eat roses, but mostly did her job grazing on the south lawn. There's something almost pastoral about the whole thing. In the midst of early 20th century politics and industrialization and all the complexity of running a country, there was a cow on the White House lawn, making butter, sometimes escaping, living a bovine life in the shadow of power. As you drift toward sleep, picture Pauline on the south lawn. Picture her grazing peacefully, unbothered by politics or presidents or anything beyond grass and the occasional rose. Picture her 2-day escape, a brief taste of freedom before returning to her life of butter production. But if one cow seems strange, what about a whole flock of sheep? Woodrow Wilson's sheep flock, 1916. World War I is raging in Europe. America isn't in it yet. That won't happen until 1917. But Woodrow Wilson is dealing with the growing tension, the pressure to pick a side, the weight of knowing that a global conflict is pulling nations apart. And in the midst of all this, Wilson decides to put sheep on the White House lawn. Not just a few sheep, 48 sheep. An entire flock led by a ram with the absolutely perfect name of Old Ike, who by all accounts had a personality that matched his dignified name. These weren't decorative sheep or pet sheep. These were working sheep with a job to do. Their job? Mowing the lawn. Think about the context here. It's wartime, or it's about to be wartime. Resources are tight. Labor is needed elsewhere. The country is gearing up for potential military involvement in the biggest conflict the world has ever seen. And someone in the Wilson administration realized that, you know what takes a lot of resources? Maintaining the White House lawn. You need groundskeepers, equipment, time, energy, all things that could be redirected to more important wartime efforts. So instead of hiring people to mow the lawn, Wilson brought in sheep. Sheep who would eat the grass, maintain the lawn naturally, and require minimal supervision. It was practical. It was resourceful. It was the kind of outside-the-box thinking that comes from wartime necessity. But Wilson and his administration didn't stop at just using the sheep for lawn maintenance, because the sheep produced wool and wool was valuable, especially during wartime. So the Wilson administration came up with a plan. They would shear the sheep and sell the wool, with all proceeds going to the Red Cross to support the war effort. And it worked. The wool sales raised approximately $100,000 for the Red Cross, a substantial sum at the time, equivalent to well over $1 million today. The president's sheep became fundraisers. They were contributing to the war effort just by existing, by growing wool, by doing what sheep do naturally. Old Ike, the ram leading this flock, became something of a celebrity. He was described as having a dignified bearing, appropriate for a sheep living on White House grounds. He led his flock with authority, keeping the other sheep in line, maintaining order among the ovine lawn crew. If you're going to have a ram representing your presidential sheep situation, you want that ram to have gravitas. And Old Ike apparently delivered. Picture the scene: 48 sheep grazing peacefully on the south lawn while war rages overseas. While Wilson is making decisions about neutrality and diplomacy and eventually military involvement, there are sheep outside, just munching grass, completely unbothered by international politics, living their sheep lives in the shadow of the executive mansion. Visitors to the White House during this period would have encountered the flock. Children were probably delighted. Sheep are relatively friendly, fluffy, the kind of animal that seems wholesome and pastoral. Adults might have found it strange initially, but once the wool fundraising angle was explained, it became patriotic. The president's sheep aren't just sheep, they're supporting our troops. They're part of the war effort. There's something deeply American about it, really. The idea that even presidential livestock should contribute, should have a purpose, should earn their keep. These weren't decorative sheep. They weren't pets in the traditional sense. They were employees in a way, workers with a job to do, and they did it well. The sheep remained on the White House lawn through much of Wilson's presidency. They became part of the landscape, part of the daily life of the executive residence during wartime. And when they were sheared, it became an event, publicized, celebrated, turned into an opportunity to raise awareness and funds for the war effort. Imagine being one of those sheep. You're just living your sheep life, eating grass, growing wool, following old Ike around, and you're doing it on the White House lawn. You're technically living in one of the most important addresses in the world. Does a sheep understand that? Probably not. But it's still true. The practical benefits were real. Reduced maintenance costs, fundraising for the Red Cross, a visible symbol of resourcefulness during difficult times. But there was also something almost therapeutic about it, wasn't there? In the midst of war and death and international crisis, there were sheep on the lawn, peaceful, calm, just being sheep. A reminder that life continues, that simple things still matter, that grass still needs to be eaten whether or not there's a war on. As you drift off to sleep, picture those 48 sheep on the south lawn. Picture old Ike leading them, maintaining order, being dignified in the way only a ram named Old Ike can be. Picture them grazing while history unfolds around them, unbothered and content. But after the dignity of war effort sheep, we're about to encounter something considerably less dignified. Calvin Coolidge's raccoon, Rebecca. Calvin Coolidge was known for being quiet. Silent Cal, they called him, a man of few words who somehow managed to be president despite his aversion to unnecessary conversation. But Coolidge's silence was apparently limited to humans because when it came to animals, the man went absolutely wild. His White House menagerie included dogs, cats, birds, a donkey, a bobcat, lion cubs, a wallaby, and, most famously, a raccoon named Rebecca. Rebecca's origin story is wonderfully bizarre. It's 1926, Thanksgiving's approaching, and someone in Mississippi decides that what the president needs for his Thanksgiving dinner is a raccoon. A live raccoon to eat. Because apparently, in some parts of America, raccoon was considered acceptable Thanksgiving fare. The raccoon arrives at the White House, presumably in some kind of crate, ready to be turned into dinner. And Coolidge looks at this raccoon and makes a decision that will surprise exactly no one who knows anything about presidential pets. He's not eating the raccoon. The raccoon is now a pet. Thanksgiving dinner will have to be something else, because this raccoon is named Rebecca, and she's part of the family now. Rebecca quickly proved to be more than Coolidge had bargained for. Raccoons are intelligent, too intelligent really. They have nimble hands, problem-solving abilities, and a natural curiosity that manifests as getting into absolutely everything. They're also nocturnal, which means Rebecca's peak activity hours were exactly when everyone else was trying to sleep. But Coolidge loved Rebecca, so much so that he had a wooden mansion built for her. Not a cage, not a simple enclosure, a mansion, a treehouse mansion, specifically designed for a raccoon, with multiple rooms and the kind of attention to detail you'd expect from custom housing commissioned by a president. Think about that for a moment. The President of the United States, the man running the country during the Roaring '20s, ordered the construction of a luxury treehouse for a raccoon. Somewhere, a carpenter received specifications for raccoon housing. Somewhere, someone had to look at blueprints and think, this is my life now. I'm building a mansion for a raccoon. Rebecca lived in her treehouse mansion, which should have contained her. Should have. But Rebecca was a raccoon, and raccoons are nature's escape artists. They can climb, they can squeeze through small spaces, they can manipulate latches with their nimble little hands. No matter how nice her mansion was, Rebecca wanted out. And frequently, she got out. Once free, Rebecca would raid the White House kitchens. Just waltz in, or waddle in, since raccoons have that distinctive gait, and help herself to whatever was available. Raccoons are omnivores with a preference for anything and everything, and they have no respect for food storage or kitchen organization. Rebecca would tear through the pantry, knock things over, make an absolute mess, and then disappear back to her mansion before anyone could catch her. The White House staff must have been thrilled. Imagine working the night shift in the executive mansion's kitchen and hearing strange noises. You investigate, and there's Rebecca, tiny hands grabbing at food, knocking over containers, living her best raccoon life among the presidential provisions. Do you chase her? Do you let her finish? Do you just sigh and clean up after her? Because what else can you do? Coolidge apparently found Rebecca's escapades charming rather than annoying. He would walk her on a leash around the White House grounds, a sight that must have been something to behold. The President of the United States walking a raccoon on a leash. In front of the press, in front of visitors, completely unbothered by how strange this looked. There are photographs of Coolidge with Rebecca. In them, he looks pleased, genuinely happy in a way that Silent Cal rarely expressed publicly. The raccoon brought him joy, and for a man known for his taciturn nature, for his economy of words and expression, that meant something. Rebecca became famous in her own right. People knew about the president's raccoon. Children wrote letters asking about her. She appeared in newsreels and photographs. She was, in many ways, the first pet of her era. More famous than any of the other animals in Coolidge's collection, more beloved by the public. But she was still a wild animal at heart. No amount of luxury housing or presidential affection could change her nocturnal nature. Her instinct to forage, her need to explore and get into everything. Rebecca was a raccoon living in captivity, and she made the best of it by regularly escaping to raid kitchens and wander the grounds. Calvin Coolidge's pygmy hippo, Billy. So we're back to Coolidge again because the man simply could not stop collecting animals. After the raccoon mansion and the bobcat and various other creatures, someone, specifically a Liberian chief, looked at Calvin Coolidge and thought, you know what this man needs? A hippopotamus. Not a full-sized hippopotamus, mind you. Those can weigh up to 4,000 pounds and are considered one of the most dangerous animals in Africa. No, this was a pygmy hippopotamus, which sounds adorable and manageable until you realize that pygmy in this context means it only weighs about 600 pounds instead of 4,000. That's still 600 pounds of semi-aquatic mammal with a mouth full of impressive teeth. The hippo arrived in 1927, a diplomatic gift that must have caused absolute chaos at the White House receiving area. Can you imagine the logistics? Shipping a hippopotamus from Liberia to Washington, D.C.? The paperwork alone would be staggering. And then someone has to actually receive this creature, sign for it like it's a particularly unusual package, and figure out where exactly you're supposed to put a 600-pound pygmy hippo. His full name, and yes, he had a full name because of course he did, was William Johnson Hippopotamus. Billy for short. Which is delightfully informal for a creature that probably terrified the White House staff on a daily basis. Pygmy hippos are native to the forests and swamps of West Africa. They need water. A lot of water. They're semi-aquatic, spending much of their time submerged or at least partially wet. Their skin produces a reddish, oily substance that protects it from the sun and acts as a moisturizer, which people sometimes mistake for blood. They're fascinating creatures, genuinely remarkable examples of evolution. They're also absolutely not suited for life in Washington, D.C. But Billy didn't know that. Billy just knew he needed water. And fortunately, the White House grounds included reflecting pools. These are shallow pools designed for aesthetic purposes to create beautiful mirror-like surfaces that reflect the sky and the surrounding architecture. They are not designed for hippos. Nobody who built those reflecting pools thought, we should make sure these can accommodate a 600-pound semi-aquatic African mammal. Billy didn't care about design intentions. Billy got in the reflecting pool and splashed around like he was back in West Africa. Can you picture it? This enormous creature crashing into these elegant reflecting pools, sending water everywhere, completely destroying the carefully maintained aesthetic. Gardeners who'd spent hours perfecting the grounds, watching in horror as Billy turned their reflecting pools into his personal splash pad. The White House staff must have been in crisis mode. How do you handle a pygmy hippo? What do you feed it? Pygmy hippos are herbivores, eating grasses and fruits and aquatic plants, but good luck explaining to the White House chef that they need to prepare vegetables for a hippo. Yes, chef, we need greens for Billy. No, not the president. Billy the hippopotamus. Yes, there's a hippopotamus. No, I don't know why either. And the noise. Hippos make noise. They grunt, they bellow, they make a sound that can best be described as something between a laugh and a grunt that echoes across considerable distances. Imagine trying to conduct presidential business while a hippo is expressing its opinions loudly from the reflecting pool. Imagine foreign dignitaries visiting and hearing what sounds like a very aggressive laugh coming from the yard. Coolidge, to his credit, or perhaps his detriment, seems to have been charmed by Billy. He had photographs taken with the hippo. He showed Billy to visitors. This is what presidents did in the 1920s. They accepted pygmy hippos as diplomatic gifts and then took photos with them like it was the most normal thing in the world. But even Coolidge had to admit that keeping a 600-pound hippo at the White House wasn't sustainable. Billy needed proper facilities, a habitat that could accommodate his needs, space to roam, and water to splash in that wasn't a decorative reflecting pool. So Billy was transferred to the National Zoo, where he could live in conditions actually designed for pygmy hippos. The zoo staff must have been simultaneously excited and terrified. On one hand, a pygmy hippo is an incredible addition to any zoo collection. They're rare, they're endangered in the wild, they're fascinating to observe. On the other hand, this is the president's hippo. If anything happens to it, if it gets sick or injured or somehow escapes, that's an international incident. No pressure, zoo staff. Billy lived out his days at the National Zoo, where he became something of a celebrity. People came to see the president's hippo. Children pressed their faces against the glass of his enclosure. He was, for a time, one of the most famous hippos in America, which is a very specific kind of fame. Think about the chain of events here. A Liberian chief decides to gift a hippo to the American president. The hippo is transported across the ocean. The hippo arrives at the White House and immediately starts using the reflecting pools as his personal swimming hole. The president takes photos with the hippo. The hippo is transferred to the zoo, where it lives as a celebrity. At no point in this chain does anyone seem to have said, wait, is this a good idea? That's the magic of the Coolidge pet collection. It wasn't about good ideas, it was about the sheer, unbridled chaos of accepting any animal that was offered and dealing with the consequences later. And in Billy's case, the consequences involved 600 pounds of hippo, turning the White House reflecting pools into his own private water park. As you drift off to sleep, picture Billy in that reflecting pool. Picture him floating there, happy and content, while White House staff stand around trying to figure out their next move. Picture the water splashing, the sun glinting off his skin, The absolute beautiful absurdity of a pygmy hippo living temporarily at the most important address in America. But if you think a hippo is exotic, just wait until you hear about the wildcat that terrorized the staff. Calvin Coolidge's bobcat, Smokey, we're still in the Coolidge administration, still in this golden age of completely unhinged presidential pet choices. And in 1928, someone in Arizona looked at Calvin Coolidge's growing menagerie and thought, you know what's missing? A bobcat. Bobcats, for those of you drifting off who might not be familiar, are wild cats native to North America. They're beautiful animals, spotted fur, tufted ears, that intense predatory gaze that reminds you they're very much not house cats. They typically weigh between 15 and 35 pounds, which doesn't sound like much until you remember that those pounds are pure muscle, claws, and teeth. They're solitary, territorial, and they hunt rabbits, rodents, and sometimes animals much larger than themselves. This is not a creature you bring into your home. This is not a creature you keep as a pet. This is a wild predator that belongs in forests and mountains, hunting and living its bobcat life far away from humans and furniture. But someone sent Coolidge a bobcat anyway, and Coolidge accepted it. And they named it Smokey, which is a delightfully innocuous name for a wild predator that was about to make everyone's life extremely difficult. Smokey arrived at the White House and immediately set about destroying everything in sight. Remember, bobcats are territorial. They mark their territory by scratching and scent marking. In the wild, this means trees and rocks. In the White House, this meant furniture. Expensive, historically significant furniture that had been in the executive mansion for decades, now being used as a scratching post by a wild cat from Arizona. Picture the White House curator discovering this. Picture them walking into a room and finding deep claw marks in an antique chair. Picture the horror. Picture them trying to explain to someone, anyone, that the president's bobcat is systematically destroying the White House furniture collection, and they're not sure how to stop it without either caging the cat or, addressing the fundamental problem that there's a bobcat living in the White House. But the furniture destruction was just the beginning. Bobcats are hunters. They have prey drive. They stalk things. And in the absence of rabbits or rodents, Smokey apparently decided that White House staff would make excellent practice targets. The historical record tells us that Smokey chased staff members, just full on chased them through the halls of the White House like they were prey animals. Can you imagine? You're a White House employee. Maybe you're carrying important documents, or you're on your way to deliver a message, or you're just trying to do your job. And suddenly there's a bobcat, a wild bobcat, chasing you through the executive mansion. Do you run? Obviously you run. Do you scream? Probably. Do you drop whatever you're carrying? Most definitely. And somewhere the president knows about this, knows that his bobcat is terrorizing the staff, and has to make a decision about what to do. The thing about wild animals is that they don't care about your intentions. Smokey didn't care that Coolidge meant well by accepting him. Smokey didn't care that the White House was supposed to be an honor. Smokey was a bobcat in an environment that made no sense for a bobcat, surrounded by moving targets and lacking any appropriate outlet for his natural instincts. Staff members probably started avoiding certain areas of the White House. Word would spread. Smokey's in the East Wing, use the other stairs. People would peek around corners before committing to walking down a hallway. The whole building adapted to the presence of a predator, because what else could they do? Coolidge, who had shown remarkable tolerance for his previous animals' behavior, the raccoon's raids, the hippo's pool splashing, apparently reached his limit with Smokey. When your staff is being actively hunted by your pet, that's probably a sign that the situation has gone too far. so Smokey was rehomed. Not just relocated, but sent to a zoo where professional handlers could manage him, where he could live in an environment designed for bobcats with appropriate enrichment and space and absolutely no furniture to destroy or staff members to chase. The zoo staff probably had mixed feelings about this acquisition. On one hand, a bobcat is a great zoo animal, native to the region, beautiful, interesting to visitors. On the other hand, this particular bobcat had just been evicted from the White House for being too aggressive. This was a bobcat with a track record. This was a bobcat that came with a reputation. But Smokey's time at the White House, though brief, left an impression. He's remembered as one of the more aggressive presidential pets, one of the few animals that even the patient, animal-loving Coolidge couldn't manage to keep. He represents the limit of presidential pet tolerance, the point at which even the most exotic pet-friendly administration says, okay, this one needs to go. Think about the stories the White House staff told afterward. Remember when the president had a bobcat? Remember when it chased you down the hallway? Remember the furniture? These became the kind of workplace legends that get passed down, exaggerated slightly with each telling, until they're part of the institutional memory of the place. Smokey lived out his days in captivity, where he probably continued being exactly what he'd always been. A wild bobcat with wild bobcat instincts, completely unchanged by his brief stint in presidential housing. He scratched things, he stalked things, he lived his bobcat life. The only difference was that now he was doing it in a place designed for that behavior. As you fall asleep, picture Smokey prowling the White House halls. Picture White House staff hearing the soft patting of paws and immediately changing direction. Picture Coolidge watching this unfold, finally admitting that maybe, just maybe, some animals are too wild even for his collection. But at least Smokey was alone. Imagine if there had been multiple large predators in the White House at once. Calvin Coolidge's lion cubs, tax reduction, and budget bureau. Okay, so after the bobcat incident, you'd think Coolidge would have learned something about keeping wild predators in the White House. You'd think someone in his administration would have said, "Sir, perhaps we should draw the line at animals that can hunt humans." You would be wrong. In 1929, Coolidge received a gift from South Africa. Not a nice painting, not a decorative item, not even something manageable like a small antelope. No, someone in South Africa sent Calvin Coolidge lion cubs, actual lion cubs, baby versions of the apex predator of the African savanna, the animal that can grow to weigh over 400 pounds and possesses the kind of teeth and claws that evolution designed specifically for taking down large prey. And these weren't just any lion cubs. These were named lion cubs, with absolutely perfect, historically specific names: tax reduction and budget bureau. Let that sink in for a moment. Someone looked at two lion cubs and named them after fiscal policy concepts: tax reduction, budget bureau. These are names that only make sense in the context of government administration, names that reflect the political priorities of the late 1920s when economic policy was a major concern. These are not names you expect to hear attached to predatory mammals. Can you imagine the meeting where these names were decided? Yes, we've received lion cubs. We should name them. How about fiscal policy terms? Tax reduction has a nice ring to it. And budget bureau, that's appropriately administrative. No one apparently said, maybe we should give them normal lion names? Because this was the Coolidge White House, where normal had been abandoned somewhere around the pygmy hippo. The lion cubs, despite their adorable names, presented an immediate problem. They were lions. Even as cubs, lions are large, strong, and possess the instincts of obligate carnivores. They play fight with an intensity that would terrify most people. Their play bites can draw blood. They're learning to hunt, even at a young age, and everything looks like potential prey. You can't just let lion cubs wander the White House. Even Coolidge, with his remarkable tolerance for chaotic animals, understood this. So tax reduction and budget bureau were caged. But here's where it gets even more surreal. They were kept in the basement. The White House basement, home to important infrastructure, storage, and now apparently lion cubs. Picture the White House staff navigating the basement. You're going down there to retrieve something, or to check on building systems, or for any of the 100 legitimate reasons someone might need to access the basement. And there are lions. Caged lions, yes, but lions nonetheless. Making lion cub noises, which are higher pitched than adult lion roars, but still deeply unsettling when you're not expecting them. The historical record tells us something even better. The lions roared during budget talks. Picture this scene. Coolidge and his advisors are upstairs, discussing fiscal policy, arguing about tax reduction. Hey, that's one of the lions' names. And budget concerns. And from below, filtering up through the floor, comes the sound of lion cubs roaring, as if the lions are commenting on the budget discussions, as if tax reduction has opinions about tax reduction. It's almost too perfect. The lions, named after economic concepts, providing a literal soundtrack to economic policy discussions. You're trying to have a serious conversation about government spending, and there's this periodic roaring from the basement reminding you that, yes, there are lions in the building, lions named after the very concepts you're discussing. How do you maintain focus in that meeting? How do you concentrate on budget numbers when there's intermittent roaring from below? Do you just pretend it's not happening? Do you wait for quiet moments between roars to make your points? Do you raise your voice to be heard over the lions? And think about visitors. Imagine being invited to the White House for a meeting. You're sitting in an office discussing important matters with the president, and you hear roaring from below. You might think you're imagining it. You might think it's some strange plumbing issue. But no, it's lions. The president has lions in the basement, named after tax policy. Coolidge kept the lions for a while. The historical record isn't clear on exactly how long, but eventually, inevitably, they had to go. Lion cubs grow into lions. Cute, manageable cubs become 400-pound predators with the ability to take down zebras. What's adorable at 3 months old becomes genuinely dangerous at 3 years old. So tax reduction and budget bureau were donated to the zoo. Another entry in the long list of Coolidge animals that started at the White House and ended up in professional zoological facilities. The zoo staff must have been developing a whole section just for ex-presidential pets. Over here we have Billy the pygmy hippo, formerly of the White House reflecting pool. And here are tax reduction and budget bureau, the lion cubs who used to live in the presidential basement. The lions lived out their lives in captivity, growing from cubs into full-sized lions, roaring in their enclosure while visitors watched and took photos. They probably had no memory of their brief time in the White House basement, no awareness that they once provided an auditory backdrop to American fiscal policy discussions. But somewhere in the historical record, their story remains. 2 lion cubs, bizarrely named, briefly housed in the White House basement, roaring during budget talks like they were offering commentary on economic policy. It's the kind of detail that's so specific, so weird, so perfectly Coolidge era that it has to be true. As you drift toward sleep, picture those budget meetings. Picture serious men in suits discussing serious economic matters while lions roar from below. Picture someone trying to make a point about tax reduction, while tax reduction, the lion expresses his own opinion through the floor. Picture the beautiful, bureaucratic absurdity of it all. And then picture how relieved everyone must have been when those lions finally went to the zoo. where they could roar all they wanted without interrupting fiscal policy discussions. But the Coolidge era eventually ended, and a new president moved in with his own ideas about appropriate White House animals. Herbert Hoover's opossum, Billy Possum. Herbert Hoover became president in 1929, right at the end of the Roaring Twenties, just in time for the stock market crash and the beginning of the Great Depression. He had a lot on his plate: economic collapse, widespread unemployment, the weight of trying to manage a national crisis, and into this chaos came Billy Possum. Billy Possum was an opossum, North America's only marsupial, a creature famous for playing dead when threatened and possessing one of the most unsettling smiles in the animal kingdom. Opossums are not typically considered cute pets. They have hairless tails, tiny eyes, and they hiss when disturbed. They're also incredibly useful in the wild. They eat ticks and other pests. They rarely carry rabies due to their low body temperature. They're basically little ecological helpers going about their business. But Billy Possum wasn't just any opossum. Billy Possum was the successor to Rebecca the raccoon. When Hoover moved into the White House, he discovered that Coolidge had left behind infrastructure, specifically Rebecca's treehouse mansion. And rather than tear it down or leave it empty, someone decided to fill it with an opossum. Picture Billy Possum moving into this raccoon mansion. It's a wooden treehouse, multiple rooms, custom built by presidential order. And now it houses an opossum. Billy must have thought he'd won the marsupial lottery. Most opossums live in trees or abandoned burrows or wherever they can find shelter. Billy got a mansion. A presidential mansion, technically. The nicest housing any opossum has ever experienced. Billy settled in, probably ate grubs and insects and whatever else opossums eat, and lived what we can assume was a comfortable life in his inherited treehouse. But Billy's story has an additional twist that elevates it from merely odd to genuinely bizarre. He served as a high school mascot. During a mascot shortage, and apparently those were a thing in 1929, a local high school borrowed Billy Possum. They took the president's opossum and used him as their mascot. Picture the logistics of this. Someone had to approach the president, or at least his staff, and ask, "Can we borrow your opossum for mascot purposes?" And someone at the White House said yes. Sure, take the presidential opossum to your high school sporting events. What could go wrong? Picture Billy at a high school football game. Picture him being paraded around, possibly in some kind of carrier, while students cheer and the opposing team tries to understand why their rivals have the president's opossum as a mascot. Picture Billy, who probably just wanted to be left alone to eat bugs and sleep in his treehouse, being thrust into the role of school spirit ambassador. Opossums are nocturnal. They're not naturally inclined toward large crowds or loud noises or being handled by enthusiastic teenagers. Billy was probably deeply uncomfortable with the entire experience, but he endured it, this temporary gig as a high school mascot, this strange interlude in his life as the presidential opossum. The mascot arrangement was temporary. Billy returned to his treehouse after fulfilling his mascot duties. But for that brief period, he represented a high school and the president simultaneously. He was the only opossum in American history to hold both positions. It's a very specific kind of fame. Hoover's presidency was defined by the Depression, by economic hardship, by the challenge of managing a country in crisis. But somewhere in the background of all that serious history was Billy Possum, living in a raccoon's old treehouse, occasionally serving as a high school mascot, just being an opossum in the most bizarre circumstances imaginable. Think about the symbolism here. The Great Depression is starting. People are losing their jobs, their homes, their savings. The country is entering one of its darkest economic periods. And the president has an opossum living in a treehouse mansion. an opossum that sometimes gets borrowed by high schools. It's almost absurdist in its contrast. The serious economic crisis happening alongside this ridiculous pet situation. But maybe that's what people needed. Maybe in the midst of all that hardship, it was oddly comforting to know that there was still an opossum in a treehouse at the White House. That some things remained ridiculous and weird even when everything else was falling apart. Billy Possum isn't as famous as some of the other presidential pets. He didn't terrorize staff like Smokey the bobcat. He didn't raid kitchens like Rebecca the raccoon. He just lived in his inherited treehouse and occasionally fulfilled mascot duties. He was, by presidential pet standards, relatively calm and manageable. But he represents something important in the history of White House animals: continuity. Coolidge left office, but his pet infrastructure remained. The treehouse mansion didn't disappear just because there was a new president. Instead, it got a new tenant. The tradition of exotic pets continued even as the country entered one of its most challenging periods. As you fall asleep, picture Billy Possum in that treehouse. Picture him curled up in the darkness, his long tail wrapped around him, completely unbothered by the economic crisis happening in the world beyond his mansion. Picture him at a high school football game, probably confused but enduring, serving as the most presidential mascot in American history. And then imagine the surprise people must have felt when they learned that the president's son had even more unusual pets waiting in the wings: Herbert Hoover's alligators. So Billy Possum was relatively well behaved. He stayed in his treehouse. He fulfilled his mascot duties when asked. He didn't cause major problems, which is good because Herbert Hoover's son Alan had other ideas about appropriate pets. Ideas that involved alligators, multiple alligators, loose alligators. It's 1930. The Depression is in full swing. Hoover is trying to manage an economic catastrophe, and his son has alligators in the White House, not in cages, not in secure enclosures, but loose, wandering around, getting into gas rooms, showing up at breakfast. Let's pause here and consider what it means to have loose alligators in the White House. Alligators are reptilian predators. They have powerful jaws capable of crushing bone. They're ambush predators, lying in wait for prey and striking with incredible speed. They're not mean exactly. They're just alligators doing what alligators do. But what alligators do is not compatible with indoor living. The historical record tells us that these alligators got into guest rooms. Picture being a White House guest in 1930. Maybe you're there for political meetings. Maybe you're a dignitary from another country. Maybe you're just an unlucky friend of the family. You go to your room after a long day, looking forward to rest, and there's an alligator just sitting there in your room because the president's son keeps alligators and they're not particularly well contained. What do you do in that situation? Do you back away slowly? Do you call for help? Do you just stand there frozen, trying to decide if this is really happening, or if the stress of the Depression has finally broken your mind? And when help arrives, when someone comes to remove the alligator, do they act like this is normal? Do they apologize? Do they explain that, yes, the president's son has alligators and sometimes they get loose, but it gets better or worse, depending on your perspective? The alligators didn't just invade guest rooms. They showed up at breakfast. They chomped on dignitaries' shoes. Picture the breakfast scene. You're at the White House for an important morning meeting. Maybe you're discussing economic policy or international relations or any of the serious matters that require presidential attention. You're sitting at the table, probably in formal dress because this is the White House in 1930 and formality matters, and you feel something at your feet. You look down, there's an alligator chewing on your shoe, your expensive, formal, dignity appropriate shoe, and the alligator is just going to town on it because alligators like to bite things and your shoe is right there. Do you scream? Do you stay calm and quietly inform someone that there's an alligator attacking your footwear? Do you try to shake it off, which is probably a terrible idea because shaking an alligator just makes it bite harder? And all around you is everyone else just continuing with breakfast, pretending that alligators at the breakfast table are perfectly normal? The phrase chomped dignitaries' shoes is doing a lot of work here. These weren't random visitors. These were dignitaries, important people, foreign ambassadors perhaps, high-ranking officials, people you're supposed to impress, people whose goodwill matters for international relations, and the president's son's alligators were destroying their shoes during breakfast. Imagine the diplomatic fallout. Imagine someone having to explain to their home country why they're returning from America with damaged shoes. Yes, the trade negotiations went well. And yes, an alligator ate part of my shoe during breakfast at the White House. No, I don't know why there were alligators. No, I don't think America is okay. Alan Hoover apparently had a thing for reptiles. Where other presidential children wanted dogs or cats or ponies, Alan wanted alligators. Plural. Multiple alligators, loose in the White House, free to wander and explore, and occasionally terrorize guests and staff. The White House staff must have developed strategies for alligator management. Check the guest rooms before guests arrive. Check under tables before serving breakfast. If you see an alligator, contact Alan immediately. Do not attempt to move the alligator yourself. These became part of the daily routine, right alongside more traditional duties like cleaning and cooking and managing the household. And through it all, Herbert Hoover was trying to manage the Great Depression, trying to figure out how to help millions of unemployed Americans, how to stabilize the economy, how to lead the country through unprecedented crisis. And in the background of all that serious, weighty responsibility was his son's alligator situation. The historical record doesn't tell us what eventually happened to Alan's alligators. Did they go to a zoo? Were they returned to wherever they came from? Did they live out their days at the White House, continuing to terrorize guests until the Hoovers left office? We don't know. What we do know is that for a period in 1930, if you visited the White House, you might encounter alligators in your room, at breakfast, eating your shoes. Dwight D., Eisenhower's baby elephant, Zimbo. Let's jump forward a bit in time, past Franklin Roosevelt's various dogs and Harry Truman's relatively normal pets, straight into the Eisenhower administration. Because in 1959, someone decided that what America needed was to give its president a baby elephant. Zimbo arrived as a gift from Africa. The historical record isn't entirely specific about which African nation, but somewhere on that continent, someone looked at their baby elephant and thought, this belongs with Eisenhower. And off Zimbo went across the ocean to Washington, D.C., to live with a 5-star general turned president who had successfully led Allied forces in World War II, but was perhaps not quite prepared for elephant management. Baby elephants are adorable. This is objective fact. They're wrinkly and clumsy, and they have trunks they haven't quite figured out how to control yet. They stumble around like giant gray toddlers, exploring everything with their trunks, making trumpet sounds that are more cute than intimidating. When people see baby elephants, their immediate reaction is usually, awe, followed by, can I touch it? But baby elephants are also wild animals. They weigh several hundred pounds even as infants. They're incredibly strong. They're intelligent. Elephants are among the smartest animals on the planet, with complex social structures and long memories. And they require specialized care, specific diets, lots of space, and ideally, other elephants for proper socialization. The White House offered none of these things. Zimbo arrived and immediately demonstrated why keeping an elephant in the executive mansion was perhaps not the best idea. He trumpeted. Not quietly, not occasionally, but regularly and loudly. Elephant calls can reach over 100 decibels. That's about as loud as a rock concert or a chainsaw. And Zimbo was doing this through the halls of the White House. Picture trying to conduct presidential business while an elephant is trumpeting somewhere in the building. You're in a meeting discussing Cold War strategy or domestic policy, and suddenly there's this enormous sound echoing through the walls. Bruh. Like someone's installed a foghorn inside the building, except the foghorn is alive and mobile and currently wandering around unsupervised. The historical accounts describe Zimbo as too wild for the White House, which is putting it mildly. Wild doesn't quite capture the chaos of having an elephant in an environment designed for humans. Wild doesn't convey the destruction a curious baby elephant can cause when it decides to investigate furniture with its trunk. Wild doesn't quite express the panic of White House staff, realizing there's an elephant somewhere in the building and they're not entirely sure where. Eisenhower, who had commanded armies and managed complex military operations, apparently met his match with Zimbo. The elephant was not responding to chain of command. The elephant was not following orders. The elephant was being an elephant in a place fundamentally unsuited for elephants. So Zimbo's White House stay was brief. Very brief. The elephant went from exotic gift to zoo resident faster than you can say diplomatic incident. The National Zoo received him, probably with mixed feelings. On one hand, an elephant is a fantastic zoo animal. On the other hand, this elephant had just been deemed too wild for the White House, which raises questions about what exactly that means for zoo staff. The zookeepers probably asked, "How wild are we talking here?" And someone from the White House probably said, "He trumpeted through the halls and couldn't be controlled." And the zookeepers probably nodded and thought, "So, normal elephant behavior then?" Because the thing about elephants is that they're always wild. Even elephants born in captivity retain their wild instincts. They're not domesticated animals. They're just wild animals living in human-managed spaces. Zimbo lived out his life at the zoo, where he had appropriate facilities, trained handlers, and other elephants for company. He probably had no memory of his brief stint at the White House, no awareness that he'd once trumpeted through the halls of American power before being exiled for being too elephantine. But his story remains part of the presidential pet archive. Another example of someone thinking a wild animal would make a good gift for the president. Another instance of the White House briefly becoming home to a creature that had absolutely no business being there. Another entry in the long list of animals that arrived as diplomatic gestures and left as zoo residents. Think about Eisenhower's resume. Supreme Commander of Allied Forces, led D-Day invasion, President of the United States, defeated by a baby elephant. It's almost poetic. All that military experience, all that leadership capability, all those strategic victories, and a baby elephant was just too much. As you drift off, picture Zimbo trumpeting through those White House halls. Picture the staff running around trying to locate him. Picture Eisenhower, who'd faced down Nazis, standing there thinking, "This elephant is going to the zoo." Picture the beautiful chaos of it all before sleep takes you. But at least elephants are large and obvious. At least you know where they are by the trumpeting. Some presidential pets were considerably smaller and sneakier. John F. Kennedy's spotted salamander. The Kennedy White House was famous for a lot of things. Camelot, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the space race, Jackie Kennedy's fashion, and less famously, but perhaps more importantly for our purposes tonight, a spotted salamander that escaped into the ventilation system. It's 1962. The Cold War is at its height. Kennedy is navigating nuclear brinksmanship with the Soviet Union. The world is tense, balanced on the edge of potential catastrophe. And in the White House, Caroline Kennedy has a pet salamander. Spotted salamanders are actually quite beautiful if you're into amphibians. They're dark, usually black or dark gray, with bright yellow or orange spots running down their backs. They're native to eastern North America, living in forests near vernal pools where they breed. They spend most of their lives underground or under logs, coming out on rainy nights to hunt for insects and worms. They're secretive, shy creatures that prefer darkness and moisture. They are not indoor pets. But Caroline Kennedy was young. She would have been about 4 years old in 1962. And children don't always understand the ecological needs of amphibians. To her, the salamander was probably just a cool animal with pretty spots, something interesting to keep and observe, a pet. Someone gave Caroline this salamander, and for a while, everything was probably fine. The salamander lived in whatever enclosure had been set up for it. It ate whatever salamanders eat in captivity. It sat around being a salamander, doing salamander things, completely unbothered by the fact that it was living in the most famous residence in America. And then it escaped. Salamanders are surprisingly good at escaping. They're flexible, they can squeeze through small openings, and they're motivated by instinct to find dark, moist places. In the wild, that means under logs or rocks. In the White House, that meant the ventilation system. Picture the moment someone realized the salamander was gone. Picture Caroline's distress. Picture the staff being informed that, yes, the president's daughter's salamander has escaped, and no, we don't know where it is. Picture someone having to tell Kennedy, who's dealing with Soviet missiles and civil rights and Vietnam, that there's a salamander loose in the building. The ventilation system of the White House is extensive. Miles of ducts and vents running throughout the building, providing heating and cooling to every room. It's a maze of metal passages, dark and relatively humid. Basically, salamander paradise. The salamander probably thought it had found the perfect habitat. Dark? Check. Hidden? Check. Away from humans? Check. This was better than any terrarium. But from the human perspective, having a salamander in the ventilation system is somewhat alarming. Not because salamanders are dangerous, they're completely harmless to humans, but because you don't know where it is. It could be anywhere. It could drop out of a vent during a cabinet meeting. It could end up in the Oval Office. It could die in the ducts and create a smell. The possibilities were all bad. The historical record describes this as an amphibian apocalypse averted, which is perhaps overstating things slightly, but I appreciate the drama. The salamander was eventually found and presumably returned to some sort of secure enclosure or released into appropriate habitat. Crisis over. But imagine being the person responsible for finding that salamander. You're crawling through White House ventilation ducts with a flashlight, looking for a small, dark amphibian that doesn't want to be found. You're probably thinking about your life choices. You're probably wondering how your career in government service led to this moment. And imagine the salamander's perspective. One moment you're in a terrarium, then you escape. Freedom. You find this amazing system of tunnels, perfect for salamanders. And then these giant humans start hunting for you, disrupting your perfect new home, determined to catch you and return you to captivity. The Kennedy children were famous for their various animals. They had dogs, ponies, hamsters, a rabbit, and various other creatures. The White House during the Kennedy years was full of young children and their pets, which created its own kind of chaos, different from the exotic animal chaos of Roosevelt or Coolidge, but chaos nonetheless. Caroline probably didn't understand why everyone was so concerned about one escaped salamander. To her, it was just her pet. It would come back eventually, right? Or she'd get a new one. No big deal. But to the staff, to the people responsible for the functioning of the White House, a loose salamander in the ventilation system was a problem that needed solving. And solve it they did, though the historical record doesn't give us the satisfying details of how exactly the salamander was recovered. As you fall asleep, picture that salamander in the ducts. Picture it crawling through the darkness, completely content, unaware of the panic it's causing. Picture the staff searching, flashlight beams cutting through the dark ventilation passages, and picture Caroline, probably unconcerned, already thinking about her next pet. Speaking of presidential daughters and their unusual animal gifts, we should talk about another elephant. Jimmy Carter's elephant, 1978. Jimmy Carter is president, dealing with the energy crisis, inflation, and the Iran hostage situation that will eventually define his presidency. And someone gives his daughter Amy an elephant. Not a stuffed elephant, not a toy elephant, an actual living elephant. Because apparently people still hadn't learned that elephants don't make good gifts for people who live in the White House. Amy Carter was about 10 or 11 years old at this point, and like many children, she probably thought having an elephant was the coolest thing ever. Unlike many children, she actually got an elephant, because when you're the president's daughter, people give you absurdly extravagant gifts. The elephant, and the historical record doesn't preserve its name, which seems like an oversight, arrived at the White House. And because no one had apparently learned from Zimbo's experience 2 decades earlier, the elephant spent time in the building itself before being shipped off to more appropriate facilities. The historical accounts mention the elephant in the Oval Office. The Oval Office, where presidents work, where important decisions are made, where the leader of the free world conducts business. And there's an elephant in it. An actual elephant with a trunk and tusks, and that distinctive elephant smell, standing in arguably the most important office in the world. Picture Carter trying to work while there's an elephant in the room. Picture him sitting at the Resolute desk. That's the fancy desk every president uses, attempting to focus on policy briefs or economic reports, and there's an elephant. You can't ignore an elephant. People say the elephant in the room to mean an obvious problem everyone's avoiding, but this was a literal elephant in the literal room, and there was no avoiding it. Did the elephant touch things with its trunk? Elephants use their trunks to explore. It's how they interact with their environment. Did it investigate the furniture, the desk, the various important objects that live in the Oval Office? Did Carter have to gently redirect an elephant trunk away from classified documents? The phrase trunked through is doing a lot of work here. It suggests movement, exploration, the elephant using its trunk to navigate and investigate, which is normal elephant behavior, but decidedly abnormal Oval Office behavior. And then there's the treaty room reference. The treaty room is where important diplomatic agreements have been signed. It's historically significant, full of important furniture and artifacts. And at some point, Carter's elephant was in there. An elephant walking through a room named for international agreements, probably leaving elephant footprints on historically significant carpet. The elephant's stay was temporary. It was always going to the zoo. This was just a brief stopover, a chance for Amy to meet her gift before it went to live somewhere with trained handlers and appropriate facilities. But that brief stopover included stops in some of the White House's most important rooms. Think about the staff's reaction. They'd probably heard stories about Zimbo from older colleagues. They probably thought, surely we've learned from that experience. Surely no one will bring another elephant into the White House. And then here's another elephant walking through the Oval Office, being the most literal elephant in the room that's ever existed. Carter, who was known for his earnestness and attention to detail, probably tried to make the best of it. He probably smiled for photos with Amy and her elephant. He probably said something kind about the gift. But internally, he was probably thinking, This elephant needs to get to the zoo immediately. The elephant went to the zoo. Crisis averted. Amy visited it there, presumably, where it lived in conditions actually designed for elephants, rather than in the executive mansion surrounded by priceless furniture and important documents. As you drift towards sleep, picture that elephant in the Oval Office. Picture its trunk exploring, its feet on the presidential carpet. Picture Carter trying to maintain his composure while hosting an elephant. And be grateful that your own workplace probably doesn't include surprise elephant visits. But at least elephants are exotic. At least there's some understanding that they're unusual. Some presidential animals were just regular farm animals that ended up in very irregular situations. George W. Bush's longhorn cow, Ophelia. Let's jump way forward now, all the way to the 2000s. George W. Bush, 43rd president, known for his Texas ranch, his folksy manner, and apparently a longhorn cow named Ophelia. Now, to be clear, Ophelia didn't live at the White House. She lived on Bush's ranch in Crawford, Texas, which makes sense because that's where longhorn cattle belong. Longhorns are iconic Texas cattle, those massive horns, that distinctive look, symbols of the American West. They're working ranch animals, not pets, and they definitely don't belong in Washington, D.C. But here's where it gets weird. Ophelia was shipped to D.C. for events. They literally transported a longhorn cow from Texas to Washington for presidential appearances, because nothing says authenticity quite like bringing your cow to press events. Picture the logistics of this. Someone had to arrange transportation for a longhorn cow from Texas to D.C. You can't just put a cow on a regular flight. You need special accommodations, a trailer, probably permits and paperwork. Someone's job was to coordinate cow travel for presidential events. And then Ophelia would show up at these events. Press conferences, photo opportunities, various gatherings where Bush wanted to emphasize his Texas roots and rancher identity. And Ophelia, being a cow, would do what cows do. She would moo. The historical record specifically mentions her mooing during press briefings. Picture this scene. Reporters gathered, cameras rolling, serious questions being asked about policy or international affairs. And in the background, or maybe right there in the foreground, there's Ophelia, mooing, just making cow sounds during official government communications. Mr. President, what's your position on moo foreign policy? There's something beautifully absurd about it. The leader of the free world, the person commanding the world's most powerful military, with a mooing cow at his press events. It's like someone decided that presidential gravitas needed to be balanced with barnyard authenticity. Bush was known for his down-home Texas image. He cleared brush on his ranch, wore cowboy boots, played up his outsider from Washington persona, despite being the son of a president and growing up deeply connected to political power. And Ophelia was part of that branding? Look, here's a real Texas rancher, and here's his cow to prove it. But imagine being a foreign dignitary trying to understand American politics during this period. You're watching news coverage of the US president, trying to gauge policy positions and diplomatic intentions, and there's a cow mooing during official briefings. What do you make of that? Is it symbolic? Is it a power move? Is it just a cow? Ophelia probably had no idea she was participating in political theater. She was just a cow, transported away from her familiar Texas ranch to strange Washington venues full of cameras and people. She probably wanted to go home. The mooing might have been bovine commentary on the whole situation. Why am I here? When's dinner? Can I go back to Texas now? The Bush Ranch in Crawford became famous during his presidency. He spent significant time there conducting business from Texas, hosting foreign leaders at the ranch for what became known as ranch diplomacy. And Ophelia was part of that world, the working ranch, the cattle, the whole Texas rancher identity that Bush cultivated. But bringing her to D.C. was a choice, a deliberate choice to transport a longhorn cow across the country for political purposes. It's the kind of thing that only makes sense in the context of modern political branding and image management. As you drift off, picture Ophelia at a press conference. Picture the reporters trying to maintain professionalism while a cow moos in the background. Picture Bush, completely comfortable with this situation, possibly more comfortable than in a traditional formal White House setting. And picture Ophelia, just wanting to be back on the ranch, accidentally becoming part of presidential history through her presence and her mooing. But if you think a cow at press briefings is strange, we need to talk about a parrot that swore at a funeral. Andrew Jackson's parrot, Pole. Let's go way back now. All the way back to Andrew Jackson, 7th president, known for founding the Democratic Party, for the Trail of Tears, for his populist politics, and for having a parrot that learned to swear like a sailor. The parrot's name was Pole, which is a classic parrot name, the kind of simple, straightforward name people give parrots when they're not being creative. And Pole lived with Jackson for years, learning his speech patterns, his vocabulary, his way of talking. And Jackson, by all accounts, had a colorful vocabulary. Parrots are incredible mimics. They don't just repeat sounds randomly. They learn context. They pick up on which words get reactions, which phrases get repeated often. They're like small, feathered recording devices, capturing the speech patterns of their environment and playing them back at often inappropriate moments. Pole captured Jackson's speech patterns perfectly. Too perfectly. The parrot learned to curse, not gentle curses, not occasional mild profanity, but apparently extended creative swearing. The kind of language that would make a 19th century church lady clutch her pearls. Jackson died in 1845, and at his funeral, at this solemn occasion where mourners gathered to pay respects to a former president, Paul was there. Why the parrot was at the funeral is unclear. Perhaps it was Jackson's beloved pet, and someone thought it should be present. Perhaps it was just kept in a room that happened to be near the funeral proceedings. Either way, Paul did what parrots do. He started talking. Specifically, he started swearing. At a funeral, at a president's funeral, in front of mourners trying to grieve with dignity and respect. The historical accounts are somewhat vague on the exact words. 19th century sources tended to be delicate about such things, but they make it clear that Pole's language was offensive enough that the parrot had to be removed from the funeral. Ejected. The president's parrot thrown out of the president's funeral for profanity. Picture this scene. The mourners dressed in black, somber and respectful. The minister speaking about Jackson's life and legacy. And then cutting through the solemnity, a parrot's voice. Cursing. Extended, enthusiastic cursing. Delivered in Jackson's own cadence and tone because that's what Pole had learned. Someone had to make the decision to remove the parrot. Someone had to approach the bird, probably still swearing, and carry it out of the funeral. Someone had to explain to other mourners, yes, that's the president's parrot. Yes, it learned to curse from him. Yes, we're removing it now. Imagine being that person. You're at a presidential funeral, a historically significant event, and your job is parrot removal. You're carrying a cursing parrot away from grieving dignitaries while the parrot continues its profane commentary. This is not what you imagined when you agreed to help with funeral arrangements. The story became legend. A parrot so profane it got kicked out of a presidential funeral. A bird that perfectly captured its owner's personality, including the parts that weren't appropriate for polite company. Pole became immortalized not for being a beloved pet, but for being too much like Jackson. Too loud, too crude, too unwilling to modify behavior for social expectations. and there's something fitting about it, really. Jackson was controversial, combative, not someone who worried much about what polite society thought. Having his parrot cause a scene at his own funeral is almost poetic. One last disruption, one last moment of chaos, courtesy of a bird that learned everything from him. As you finally drift off to sleep, picture Pole at that funeral. Picture the mourners' faces as they realize what's happening. Picture the parrot, completely unbothered, just repeating what it had heard for years. And smile, because somewhere in history, a president's parrot got thrown out of a funeral for swearing. And that's the kind of absurd detail that makes history worth remembering. And that brings us to the end of our tour through the presidential pet archives. We've met grizzly bears and pygmy hippos. We've encountered snakes in purses and badgers with ankle-biting habits. We've witnessed alligators at breakfast and parrots swearing at funerals. We've seen roosters receive state honors and raccoons living in custom-built mansions. We've watched presidents, people running the most powerful country on earth, make the consistent, repeated decision to bring wild animals into their homes and hope for the best. And here's what I love about all of it. These stories are real. Every bizarre detail, every absurd moment, every instance of a president looking at an apex predator and thinking, yes, pet. All of it actually happened. Verified, documented, part of the official historical record. So the next time you're stressed about your own life choices, just remember, a president once accepted tiger cubs as a diplomatic gift and named them Tax Reduction and Budget Bureau. A president's son let alligators loose in guest rooms. A president's raccoon had a better house than most Americans. We're all just doing our best, even presidents, especially when it comes to pet ownership. Sleep tight. And be grateful you're not trying to conduct international diplomacy while a hippo splashes around in your reflecting pool. Sweet dreams.